Our afternoon session. I hope you guys had a great networking break out there. So in the previous session, or in the previous panel, we looked at education and research as a very broad subject. Now we're going to focus in on microgravity and examine it from concept to launch. Todd Meyerrose from Talos Ventures will be leading the next panel discussion. Please join me in this welcoming Todd and our panelists.
Hello. So thanks very much for hosting this panel discussion today. I think we have an excellent panel, and I hope we have a good amount of engagement from the audience. So my name is Todd Meyerrose. I'm a consulting associate professor at Stanford in the Department of Structural Biology, and I work extensively in early stage technology, mostly in biotechnology and healthcare. Obviously, I have an interest in the space industry as well. So the basic concept for this panel is to present something like a vertical cross-section, both literally and figuratively, of the key components to get a project into space. What are the commercial requirements for these? What are the incentives at each stage within the supply chain? And how does this create an ecosystem for people to build and develop research in the microgravity environment? So to date, the majority of the presentations and panels that I'm acquainted with have more of a horizontal slice of the industry. And I'm looking to present a slightly different perspective on this by getting differing viewpoints along this vertical supply chain. So, as such, we have representation from inventors from Chrysalis BioTherapeutics, companies working to commercialize the technology, ZGSI, hardware development, TechShot, and flight services, Blue Origin. To complete this picture, Jacque Vallee is joining us, and he will provide some insight on how external venture capitalists look at this sort of a value proposition and what steps are required to be completed in order to create a fundable project in the eyes of an investor. Finally, for the audience, I would like to structure this panel as a conversation, and we'll actively encourage discussion from you during our conversation with the panelists. If you have anything, please get my attention, and let's integrate that into the conversation. So I'm going to briefly introduce the panel, but I'd like to leave it up to them to discuss details of who they are, what they do, what their business is. First, we're going to go in alphabetical order. Kira Blackwell, Executive Director of Operations for Chrysalis BioTherapeutics. Wave. And I'll tell you a little bit about her. So prior to joining Chrysalis, she was the Director of Strategic Relations for the Houston Technology Center at NASA Johnson Space Center. Prior to that, Ms. Blackwell served as the Director of Strategic Relations for Jacobs for 7 years, working to create collaborative partnerships in energy, life sciences, and information technology. Mark Deuser, founder and CEO of TechShot. Mark has been with TechShot for 24 years now, and you can tell he works with government contractors because there is absolutely no other information online about him. So we'll have to pry a little bit into his background to get a little more information there. Rich Godwin here at the end. Rich is here representing what I think of as the second tier of the commercial spaceflight supply chain, filling the next step in this commercial development pipeline. He has formerly built companies that sell books and music and was once the proprietor of an English manor. He swears it's exactly like the space industry, so I'm looking forward to that. Next to him, we have Jacque Vallee. Jacque is here in the capacity of a venture capital investor, and he has quite a diverse background as a computer scientist, an author, and a former astronomer. He is an active investor with over 60 startups under his belt, 18 of which have developed into an IPO stage or acquisition. And finally, he is a prolific author running the range of novels, technical books, and research papers. And finally, curse of a last name, Erika Wagner, Business Development Director of Blue Origin. Erika completed a joint degree at Harvard and MIT, completing her PhD in Health Sciences and Technology with a focus in bioastronautics. Prior to that, she built the X Prize Lab at MIT from the ground up, developing a network for teaching and research on innovation incentives. Transitioning to Senior Director of Exploration Prize Development for the X Prize Foundation. She's an engineer and program manager, and she loves working on really, really hard problems. So I think she's a great addition to this panel as well. So I'd like to take just a few minutes for each panelist to introduce themselves, what their company is, what they do for the company. Feel free to share anything on current status. If you have something you'd like to talk about that you're working on that's interesting, projected timelines on future development, I'll leave it to you. And since we are focusing on a commercial product development aspect here, I'd like for you to specifically include a few key points here to frame the rest of the conversation. Very simply, just who's your product, or I'm sorry, what is your product, who is your customer, and how do you make money in that interaction? Where do you sit in the ecosystem, and just sort of lay that out from an economic standpoint so that we can frame a discussion on commercial development. So I'll let you guys get going.
All right, so are we working here? I'm going to keep talking until this comes on. Is that going to work? It's not going to work. How are we going? Ah, fantastic. Okay, great. So hi, my name is Erika Wagner. I am Business Development Manager at Blue Origin. And in the context of a NewSpace conference, I have perhaps the most logical place in the supply chain, which is that I carry things up and down. And I think many of you are probably familiar with the bare bones of Blue. We were started in 2000 by Jeff Bezos. We are a human spaceflight company, starting with suborbital products and moving our way over towards the orbital markets. Our first product is the suborbital New Shepard craft. It can carry both researchers and hardware up to suborbital altitudes of about 100 kilometers. And we are really looking at starting first in an autonomous flight mode, which means we are coming into the research and payload markets as our initial offering. And then we'll be carrying people up both for tourism and for research and education missions before we transition into the orbital world. In terms of where we are in our product development, we have sort of two components to our vehicle, a propulsion module, which has been in testing since 2011. We have a new engine that's powering that vehicle that's on the test stands now, a 100,000-pound LOX hydrogen engine. And we have a crew capsule that was tested in its pad escape mode in October of last year that's going to be holding our experiments and our humans as we move into flight. I think for me, what's really interesting about this research market, Jeff was on the Jimmy Fallon show last year, and he said there's only two problems with space. It's dangerous and it's expensive. And we're trying to solve both of those. And it's interesting when you look at the spaceflight market, because traditionally satellites have been the big basis for commercial spaceflight, but the markets there are relatively insensitive to price. Even as prices have dropped, we haven't seen volumes of satellite launches increase very much. But I think that the unique thing about, particularly in the suborbital market, is both humans and research are highly sensitive to price and highly sensitive to availability. And I think that you're going to see, as the commercial companies come online, that being more responsive to the needs of the research community and driving down the risk and improving the timelines and cost for tourism are going to be game changers in what's happening. So we are really looking to come in, as I said, first into this research market. And for us, success looks like an ecosystem where we are only one part. And I think if I can just sort of encapsulate that in one final sentence, is that I want to have other companies making a lot of money using my product. Because if they are making a lot of money, then I am able to be successful. And I think that I'm going to turn it over this way, because Mark, you're going to be one of the people who's hopefully making a lot of money off of my product.
Thank you, Erika. Yes, I'm Mark Deuser. I'm the CEO and co-founder of TechShot. We've been in business for almost 25 years now. Actually founded the company in 1988. We are payload developers and integrators, and we've been quite successful at both the orbital and suborbital level with conducting experiments. Historically, what we've done a lot of are biological payloads. We've been quite successful there, everything from cell culturing to small animal research, cell separation, and a number of other biological payloads. But we've also gotten into some of the physical science payloads more recently. Interestingly enough, TechShot has actually its roots in the commercial space business. The other co-founder of TechShot actually was the PI on an experiment that was funded by Kentucky Fried Chicken. It involved chicken embryos. This was in the very early days of the shuttle program, when they had a program called the Shuttle Student Involvement Program. He was actually a regional winner in 1983. They found Kentucky Fried Chicken as a sponsor. We were fortunate enough to develop the payload, the first chicken embryo experiment payload in the U.S. It was on the Challenger, unfortunately, when it exploded, but we had another opportunity to do it. Flew it in 1989 successfully and used it as a springboard to develop our passion of developing payloads. So we've been at it ever since. Our eventual customer, even though we've been very successful with the government, the federal government, as the buyer of our products and services, we've been very successful with trying to develop more of a commercial mindset. And so we've been a part of some of the early CSCs and CCDSs and everything else that NASA has tried to do with commercializing space. We see lots of opportunity now. We've got lots of good experience at having done this before, but we've got a lot of young engineers on our staff. That's our focus, is doing the engineering, doing it well, coming up with innovative ideas. We've had nearly 90 SBIRs, phase 1 and phase 2s, from various agencies, not just NASA, but a lot of them are focused on biological or physical science type of work. So with that, our goal is to try to find customers that are interested in using our payloads. We are implementation partner with CASIS. We've worked with a number of other entities that are involved and interested in doing experiments in space. We feel very qualified in being able to provide those services and are looking to expand it well beyond what we're doing with the government customer. So I will turn it over to Kira and let her tell a little bit more about her company.
Thank you, Mark. My name is Kira Blackwell, and I work for Chrysalis BioTherapeutics, and we're currently developing a peptide that has multiple indications for the broader, mankind. And I came from aerospace, so I realized that there were some needs that NASA had, mitigating radiation effects on the body that we could actually possibly help with, because we know it works here on Earth. And, I'm going to give you some stats real quick. 1 out of every 1,000 compound that actually attempts to get FDA approval and go all the way through that process, 1 out of 1,000 actually makes it. The average cost on the low end for a product to actually get from start to finish FDA approval is about $4 billion. And that's nothing to kind of, shake your head at. And, knowing those numbers, and also knowing that just the application alone for a product that actually would go through clinical trials for FDA approval, just the application alone is $1.8 million. You better hope that your product in biotech is going to have multiple applications before you invest millions of dollars into it to get it where it needs to be, and hoping that you actually get FDA approval in the end. Now, so I say all that to say, why did I share that information? Well, I'm trying to eliminate any competition. No, I'm just kidding. No, the truth is as we were looking at this, we're funded through NIH. We just completed a phase 1 SBIR grant with the National Cancer Institute because our product actually works. And knowing that some of these actual applications might be applicable to space, we thought, well, let's work with NASA and see if it's something they want to work with us to see if actually it might work in a zero gravity environment. It's not really a huge market for us. I know that's kind of funny because we're at a NewSpace conference, but it's not a huge market for us. But NIH is helping us fund research. We've had over $100 million invested into the research for our peptide currently, and it works. And those implications are mitigating the effects of, radiation, high levels, nuclear radiation. It has actually implications in cardiovascular, bone repair, and dermal healing. And so when you look at all of that, you go, gosh, those are problems that our astronauts are going to encounter or are currently encountering. Then there might be some way where we have some synergies where as we test it in a zero gravity environment, it actually might work in space, and we'll continue to use the data and continue to develop it here on Earth so that everyone can benefit from it. And so basically that's what we're doing. We're moving forward with that. It takes between 8 and 10 years for a product to go from start to finish for FDA approval. So, you're looking at 8 to 10 years, $4 billion, and 1 out of every 1,000. Kind of sounds like the space program, like taking a shot at. Yeah, the odds are against you, but, what is it? We like to do things that are hard. So with that, I'm going to pass it on. If anybody has any questions, just let us know.
So, need to master this technology first. This one. This one works? Yes, okay. Well, as Todd mentioned, I'm a venture capitalist, so my products are companies. We have led 21 companies to the public markets over our last few funds, and obviously looking to do more. In terms of full disclosure, I should mention that I'm on the advisory board for Bigelow Aerospace, and also that I had the pleasure of being part of a team that was selected by NASA in 2006 to run Red Planet Capital, which was the venture arm of the agency. It was a short-lived pleasure because the government, the White House, decided that private equity was not something that government agencies should do, so they stopped actually 5 different agencies and stopped their venture funds. In the process, we supplied NASA with 180 technology notes describing actual working companies with working management and products that could either be licensed to the space program. Those were commercial companies with dual-use applications into the American space program. Some of them we were looking to actually finance alongside other venture capital organizations. Some of them could have continued with licensing agreements with some space companies. Unfortunately, that program was stopped. In those 180 companies, there were a number of companies attacking biology and attacking space medicine and related issues. That experience has convinced me that perhaps in the long run, the greatest contribution that will be seen from the space effort will be in human medicine. The challenges are enormous. I mean, we already know how to get to Mars. We have a 50-50 probability of landing upright, but we can improve that and eventually get people there. The problem is, will they be alive when they get there? And when you look at the challenges are here on Earth. I don't need to tell you how valuable a drug would be if it could control the deterioration of bone, or if it could control the deterioration of muscle. Here on Earth, I mean, those are multi-billion-dollar drugs that every big pharma company would love to acquire and would love to market. The space program is really the way of testing that. Biology, when we talk to, we're not experts in the venture capital community, but we talk to a lot of experts. And when we talk to biologists, we realize that biology is a science. It's probably the only science with one data point, G = 1. We don't know anything about the situation of the human body at G different from 1. A little bit of experience on the moon, some experience in microgravity, but not much. So everything, it's a very open field with enormous potential, and again, enormous potential for profits down here on Earth with real products that humans can use. The community in general, when I talk to my partners and my colleagues in venture capital, is skeptical about the space program for 2 reasons. One is timeline. There are a lot of things that, I mean, we were on the moon 35 years ago, okay? And we're not on the moon now. So if you had invested 35 years ago, I mean, you would be out of business a long time ago. So the assessment is, well, tell me when these guys are really serious, when we're really going to do something that will result in real products. The other thing is the culture. We still have a culture of engineering not a culture of biology, that many of the real problems now that we've overcome the engineering problems, or most of them, the real challenge is going to be in biology, and there is a culture change that needs to occur. Last point, it's still possible to make money. One of the startups that we identified under Red Planet Capital is a company that we have funded, and we've continued to fund it with our own money. It's a company that you can look at on the web. It's called AlterG for Alter Gravity. It's an outgrowth of the Apollo program. And the Apollo, the engineers built a system that was essentially a treadmill with a device under which that would go around your waist, under which you could change air pressure so that you could arbitrarily change the effective weight of an astronaut to simulate walking on the moon or walking on other planets. You could also make them heavier or make them lighter by increments of 1%. And we've taken that invention, turned it into a commercial product, which is now used in physical therapy, in rehab for strokes, Parkinson's disease, and a number of other rehabilitation situations. And we've sold over 1,000 machines so far to hospitals. And that company has been continually financed by other venture capital companies and by ourselves. So that shows that you can take an idea that came from the Apollo program and apply it to something that helps humans today and makes money today.
Following on from what Jacque just said, my name is Rich Godwin. I'm the CEO of Zero Gravity Solutions, Inc. And we're a newly minted public company, just started trading on Thursday, actually. I've been involved in space advocacy for a long time. And I always thought, what can you put on a camel's back, walk it all the way from China to Istanbul and still make a profit? It's got to be high value, low volume. And so you think about silken spices and you make a profit. You don't think about redesigning the camel, let's put more legs on it, let's get it to eat less grass. You know, you think, what have I got? And how do I make money out of it? And obviously from space, I'm trying to think about the Silk Road of space. You think, what's the lowest volume, highest value is data, obviously. But pretty close on its heels are stem cells. We know that there's a lot of differential gene expression goes on in space in the microgravity environment that is very different from what happens on the ground. And so my founding scientist, John Wayne Kennedy, you can't forget that name, he postulated, he was approached by NASA actually back in the early 2000s. How do you save the ISS? How do you utilize the ISS in botanical and biological? And he was a senior scientist at US Department of Agriculture and at the EPA. Came up with an idea about 3 years after that and said, look, we're going to get two things that are going to happen up there. We're going to get this differential gene expression almost on an epigenetic scale. What happens is, you know, the environment on Earth for life has always changed. It's been dry, hot, wet, cold, but 1G has always been a constant. And when you take away 1G, the plant cell or the human cell or a mammalian cell perceives it as a threat. It's never experienced this before. And so it turns on all its survival mechanisms, and those survival mechanisms tend to be differential gene expression. On the ground, a plant cell will try and build structure. It uses half of its energy to build structure just to stand up in 1G. Well, it doesn't need that in microgravity. What does it do with the excess energy? Differential gene expression. So what you tend to find is that the genome, the old genome, which a lot of us have been referred to as junk DNA, starts to turn on because it's trying to deal with this threat, this perceived threat of microgravity. And we don't know of any other environment that you can put the cell in that gets almost this epigenetic gene expression right across the board, up and down. Now, we've flown 6 flights to the space station. The first one we did was the USDA ARS labs, Agricultural Research Service labs, was the PICM-19 pig liver cells. And then we flew 5 flights of the Jatropha curcus seed. Jatropha is a biofuel candidate. It produces, when it's planted properly and it's mature, it produces 600% more yield than corn or switchgrass. It'll grow in scrubland, it'll grow in wet, It'll grow in dry, can't take the cold. So this is a plant that was actually used by the Japanese to power all their airplanes in World War II. It was grown in Brazil. We found a company that's very interested in Jatropha, a private company in Florida. They sponsored the flights, these flights of the Jatropha in conjunction with the University of Florida. And we've identified 55 genes in the genome that are cold resistant. The problem with the plant is that you can only grow it in the tropics. We want to grow it in West Texas for obvious reasons. This plant produces a big green berry. It looks like a big olive bush. Produces a big green berry. You squash it, out comes high-octane jet fuel. I mean, you press it, it's jet fuel. You just have to filter it. 600% more yield per hectare than corn or switchgrass. 5 tons per hectare of jet fuel. It will grow in the West Texas scrublands, maybe around the old nodding donkeys out there in the middle of the oil infrastructure. And that's what we'd like to do. And we think we're pretty close to being able to do that. Now, we obviously still have to plant it, hybridize it, put it back up, and then mass propagate the stem cell. We might be able to do that on the ground, but we can mass propagate in a 3-dimensional matrix in space faster than we can on the ground. So the first flight is potentially a multi-billion-dollar product. We would own the IP. We would license it to the company who would be planting it and growing it. They've already been told by 2 clients that the 2 clients will buy everything that they can produce on a worldwide basis. One is the largest provider of jet fuel, of distribution jet fuel in the world. The other is the DoD. So we think that that's worth a lot of money. That one plant alone, if we can make it happen, justifies the whole cost of ISS. But it's just the start. We just put a proposal in today to Cases for their mammalian stem RFP, and we are going to be flying amniotic stem cells with Dr. Anthony Atala of Wake Forest. He's the guy you might have seen on TED with the 3D printed organs. Very, very exciting human regenerative medical aspect of being able to grow different cells on orbit, either in a mass propagation 3-dimensional matrix, or possibly, and what I would like to say here is we brought on a very keyed up, the top team I think that we can now. I brought in Neil Pellis of JSC, ex of JSC. I've got Dave Wolf, the astronaut. I have several other people, including now Dr. Atala working with us. And I think that in the near future, we might be able to grow beta islet cells, pancreas beta islet cells in space that can't be done on the ground. Now, if we can do that, that's a huge, huge advance for regenerative medicine. And there are reasons why you can do this easier in space than you can on the ground. Now, obviously, we are going to be testing everything on the ground first, because if we can do it on the ground, what do you need to go to space for? But if we can't do it on the ground, then we take it to space. We are going to be the world's first zero-gravity biotech company. You know, there was pharma, there was biotech, now there's zero-gravity biotech. And we will, I believe, open this Silk Road from space of high-value, low-volume products from space, which eventually, hopefully, would lead to industrialization of low Earth orbit.
There we are. So several of you have mentioned dual-use applications, and so I'd like to hear your thoughts a little bit on both strategically and tactically as you're developing product. How do you make, this is a challenging transition from a spaceflight application to a ground-based, or from a ground-based to a spaceflight. And it ties in, I'd like to hear, you know, whether your concerns are with tech transfer. What do you think are the major gates and hurdles in that interaction, and how do you sort of think about that decision as you're developing product, as you're building dev? I'm going to start with Erika, because I think she's got the most challenging situation. I don't know how she's going to answer this. So,
Hard one, because all I'm building is a space product right now. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and pass on this one, and I'll come back and think about the next one.
Kara.
Well, currently we're working on a proposal actually to submit to Cases, and strategically we were laying it out so that we knew that the data that we would gather for both the ground experiment to test it before it actually went into space, that both the entire experiment actually needs to be applicable to both, or the data we need to be able to apply it to what we're what our endpoint is. And endpoint is we want to commercialize the technology and get it out there on the market so it can actually save lives. So for us, when we were designing it, we have to look at it from that perspective, because if we were just going to design something that was just going to fly into space, and what are the benefits of that, then it really takes us off our schedule, and it actually would cost us money and time, where we don't really have that. We're a very small team. So I think that for us, any experiment that we do, whether it's ground or whether it's in space, we have to look at it from the big picture. How's this going to get us to our endpoint, which is, commercializing the technology. So when we designed it, that's what we did, and we'll see if it gets funded down the road. But that's sort of for us how we have to lay out any of the experiments from a biotech perspective, because I already gave you guys the numbers, and it costs way too much money to do it for nothing, right?
What's the incentive for big pharma or biotech to try to translate some of their medicines that are approved here on the ground to space? Because they want to hold on to their money for their shareholders. They don't want to do anything that's unnecessary. If they shoot their molecule into space and you find an adverse reaction to it, does that have to be reported to the FDA? Generally, once you have an approved medicine, you don't want to do more than you have to do. Otherwise, if you uncover something nasty about some off-target toxicology or something, it might restrict your usage of that in a certain indication and then therefore cut into your revenues. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
So just to repeat real quickly, the question was basically, what is the incentive for a pharmaceutical or biotechnology company to participate in a space flight-based experiment?
And so I can do the quick answer, because you probably have a longer background in this than I do. But for us, because we can actually take the data. So we're investing in it, and we want to test it in a microgravity environment, because we believe that the applications could actually help NASA down the road, but also we can still utilize that same data to get us to our endpoint. So we're not really losing money in doing that. We're not losing. If you strategize well and you plan your experiment well, so that data can be used for both ground application and space application, then you're not really wasting money down the road. And the fact that it actually could be beneficial down the road for long-term duration flight, that's a need that NASA has down the road anyway. They've got to solve that problem, or any type of space travel or anything like that. It's a problem that they're going to have to find a solution for. So for us, we're investing in that. The other part of your question, you said, you might not want to uncover some things that might not actually get you to the point where you get FDA approval. We're a little bit different in that. We would rather uncover those things in the beginning, because our entire goal through all of this is actually to save lives. And so if there's actually something out there that might be harmful to humans, we would rather know in the beginning, so that we didn't, and as we're testing it with animals, so that we didn't actually harm anybody. So, and that's just our perspective. Our tagline is saving lives through innovation. I mean, that's truly what we want to do. And we just recently submitted a proposal to the National Cancer Institute for an SBIR Phase 2. And one of our aims is actually to actually, test for any kind of, to stain for any type of cancer markers, because we want to make sure that it doesn't actually stimulate, cancer growth. And maybe not every company would do that, but for us, that's essential. So.
If you uncover something that's maybe only an artifact in space, but it may cause the FDA to scrutinize the use of the medicine that's already generating money for the company on the ground. That's kind of more where I was going. Of course, we want to cover all the bases and find out if these investigational agents are causing problems. But I was just more thinking, they really don't want to do anything once it's approved, unless it's mandated by the FDA for post-market surveillance, like a phase 4 or something. But I don't know what the FDA's policy on that would be. If you had a reported event up in space and how it would affect usage of the drug on the ground.
And to be realistic, and you might be able to talk to this, I don't know what FDA's policy is for spaceflight. I don't know, and obviously there's companies out there that are developing products for space, but there has to be a ground application or else they wouldn't still be in existence, is my thought. And so those FDA approvals would probably cover all of that, I would think.
I completely agree with that. When we talk to big pharma, which obviously we've done in looking at investment opportunities, what they tell us is their problem is really different from that, because they see space as really as a fundamental research opportunity. They are a long way from developing therapeutic agents or anything else based on that. That will come later. But their problem in their interaction with the different space agencies around the world has always been, over the last 10 or 15 years, that all we give them is a glove box where the astronauts are going to run the experiment. And the results have been disaster. The payload manager, in a glove box, what can you do? So you're going to glue a few scorpions to a piece of cardboard, okay, and give it to the payload manager. The payload manager is going to mount it upside down because he doesn't know, how a scorpion likes to live. The astronaut doesn't know how much a scorpion needs to eat or how much oxygen a scorpion consumes in 24 hours. So finally, the people from Amgen, not to mention them, or any number of the big pharma who were extremely interested in experimenting in space, said, look, we'll come back 10 years from now when you can give us a lab where we can send our technicians and where we can really do real experiments. In the meantime, there is a lot of things that can be done at the cell level or with small organisms, and that has already been mentioned. So if you want to stop a cocktail party of biologists, there is one question you can ask them informally. Now that you guys have decoded the genome, how many genes test for up and down? And they say, what do you mean? And you say, well, when a baby is born, that baby knows which way is up and which way is down. How does a baby know that? Well, so you get answers. They all have an answer from 200 genes, 2,200 genes, 3,000 genes. You get different answers. So I finally cornered Craig Venter, and I asked him that question, and he said, nobody has any idea. Now, if Craig Venter says that nobody has any idea how many genes test for up and down, we have a lot of work to do, a lot of work. So then the biologists are not stupid, so they tell me, well, you talk to the guys at NASA, surely they've done a protein inventory of their astronauts before and after flight, right? NASA is a big, they do all those things. So I go back to NASA and ask them, and they say, well, we did something on a frog a few years ago, and yeah, we have some partial answers, but is that true? So we have a lot of work to do, but the problem is not the FDA. I think if there will be so many potential breakthroughs that I think Big Pharma would be delighted to go to the FDA with their results and with their proposals.
Just for the record, I heard about the frog also.
When I was working for SpaceX on Dragon Lab, I was trying to find out if there was a pent-up demand for a free-floating microgravity lab, and so I was approaching everybody. I approached the head of R&D at a major oil company. We approached the pharma companies, and there was a whole mixture of information that was going around in their heads or not. First question was, what can I do in space that I can't do on the ground? And when you explain it to them, they kind of go, wow, that's interesting, I didn't know that. This is with companies that had already done work back in the 80s. But those people had all gone away. There was always this burned feeling of dealing with NASA, budget on, budget off, budget on, budget off. Let's try and get a tweaking flight, got to wait for 2 or 3 years. There's a sea change gone on now in the fact of National Lab, cases, and the commercial space sector coming in. 18 flight opportunities up next year, and potentially 8 down. And that's prior to the new commercial crew vehicles coming on in maybe 3 or 4 years' time. So one of the things I found out, which quite stunned me, is that R&D in the pharma industry is a very hot topic. And you'll find that most R&D companies, most companies who are doing R&D in pharmaceuticals, they expect a 300% ROI on R&D. And you go, how can you get 300% ROI on R&D? Guess what? You buy it. You find somebody little, you go along and say, hey, thanks, pal, here's a check, go to Hawaii. Thank you very much, bye-bye. Or you data mine the archives. And that's what I found out. That is the way that the R&D is being done by big pharma these days. And it's smart from a business standpoint. So it's like, it's an opportunity for us small little guys to go and do this work, put out the flesh and the toil and the sweat and the blood and get it done, raise the money, and hopefully eventually go to Hawaii. But after you've done something really, really good, I hope.
So I'd like to sort of refine this just a little bit, this question, and then I'll get to your question in the audience. A sort of key component of innovation as we think about it now is fast cycle iteration, which from the outside manifests as fail, 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 and that kind of works. So how do you take a process like that, which has been shown to produce great results, right? This is the best practices model of innovation. How do you accommodate a practice like that into something with such a high capital cost hurdle? And how do you think about the risk within your own company to pursue something like this, given the potential payout with the market you're looking at? And it can be a very general answer about how you think about innovation, how you try to incorporate these things, or if you think it's not feasible in your particular instance, and if not, then why not?
That one might apply to me a little bit better. So the Blue Origin's corporate slogan, painted on our walls, is Gradatum Ferociter, which means step by step ferociously. We have some nice little turtles that go along with that. But we are very much an incremental development company and predicated on what's the first small step we can take, what's the next small step that builds on that. We've gone from a sort of 3,000-pound class engine to 30,000-pound class to 100,000-pound class. We've flown 4 vehicles now. And I think every step along the way, what we try to do is actually maximize the risks that we're taking in the development process so that we minimize the risks that we are fielding in our products. And I think that that's something that's not always an obvious choice. So every time we put our engine on the test stand, almost every test, we push it to redline. And that's intentional. We don't tend to have fixed profiles that we're running. We have fixed profiles we're going to run, and then when we get to the end of the question we're asking, here's the next questions we can ask, the next risks we can take. We're going to protect the hardware, but we're going to learn as much as we can from every test that we do. And I think that sort of orientation towards incremental work, taking risks up front, is something that's allowed us to be always learning, and that sort of meets the framework you're talking about there, Mark. Todd?
Well, and from TechShot's perspective, I think we mitigate that risk of failure in the laboratory, and we're doing it every day. We fail quite frequently in the laboratory. What's not an option is to fail once we get in space. So that's why we are willing to fail in the laboratory. We learn from those mistakes. We find out what works, what doesn't work. It's a very important part of hardware development. It's a very important part of the science aspect as well. We've got our own science people that are doing as much as they can to wring out this hardware in the laboratory, on the ground, before it ever gets to space. That's a very crucial aspect of any flight experiment, any flight payload that you want to develop. That's the way that you really mitigate the chances of it being a failure in space and maximize the chance of being successful.
And just to build on that, I think that one of the things suborbital starts to offer is a chance to do that before you go up to orbital platforms. And it's not so much about the money. It's not that I'm going to invest so much money in my R&D on ISS. We already heard that the NASA is highly subsidizing that market right now. But for companies who want to understand, does my hardware work? Are my first principles right? To come and take a shakedown flight on a suborbital vehicle before you invest the years of time it's going to take to complete a space station experiment allows you to do some of those iterations much faster.
And I will add that we have taken advantage of the suborbital flights, and we've seen some failures in suborbital flights that helped to make sure that we were successful once we got into low Earth orbit. So I will testify to the success of making that a next step in the process beyond testing in the laboratory. Suborbital is a great way to do that.
Question?
It's a mix of comments or my insight and questions. So for the past year, I've been interviewing PIs with scientific investigations on the ISS, probably in the 50. And I've been trying to extract trends, what worked, what hasn't worked, what should really change to enable that platform to become truly useful or and promote a return on investment. So one of my findings was actually that the most successful investigations corresponding to those PIs who flew in space themselves. So that goes back to your comment. Now, my understanding was that a lot of other PIs were really afraid to try to go in space. So perhaps that's one thing that we could discuss here. How can we encourage PI to go in space and fly their own experiments, at least in the initial phases, those of setup, before they become sort of automatized or set up for being run in microgravity? My other comment was I've been actually reviewing lately the FDA, what kind of drugs has FDA approved over the past 2 years, which companies have owned those drugs, which one have lost revenues over the past 2 years. One thing that I found in terms of FDA, and again, I'm not talking on behalf of FDA, it's just my observation, they've introduced a fast track approval for drugs, and my concern with that was that they don't really have that number of testing that they would really desire, but they allow that for having drugs out on the market because there's really nothing else out there. And I really would like to hear your opinion on that. What do you think about that? So if there are diseases that basically there's absolutely no treatment out there, FDA provides this fast track to allow these drugs to be on there. So is, for example, Microgravity a platform that could enable such thing as fast track drug approval? And the other observation was the lost revenue. A lot of the companies had patents that expired, and it looks like in their R&Ds there wasn't maybe the right direction for exploring new patents. And is that something that we could bring forward to these companies? Maybe if you explore the microgravity environments, you could come up with new patents, and that should be part of consideration for your business development plan. So,
okay, so I think I'm going to try to refine that just a little bit into a short question. And I guess the question then is, if we look at the FDA patterns of drug approvals, or NMEs, new molecular entities, from 2000 to 2010, it's a very different profile than from 2010 to 2012. And they're looking at a lot of mechanistically new in class drugs that are getting approved, and that's a great thing for discovery. So I guess the question then would be, given this new environment of the FDA's willingness to support new projects, how does that change your viewpoint of risk into new therapeutic indices, new technologies, and does that encourage your willingness to take more risk in a spaceflight environment to get a faster model into a tough disease?
Okay, hello. One part of the question that you asked was, has anything been done in space that has resulted in an approved drug? And something, I think, is Carl Carruthers in here? Carl, he told me, he confirmed something that I'd known for a while last week, and that on STS-107, Columbia, there were two protein crystal growth experiments on that vehicle. And the one was urokinase, the other was an interferon. Urokinase was done by PTA, I think, and the interferon was being grown by shearing plow. The that experiment, both experiments actually survived the fall to the ground. One landed in an IHOP parking lot. The interferon from shearing plow, they were able to save the crystals, and they were able to develop a hepatitis C vaccine from the basis of that solution. And it blew my mind when I first heard this. I thought, are you kidding me? Are you telling me that, why don't we know about this? Why hasn't NASA made a big fuss about this? Well, it's proprietary. But I've been looking for information. It was only last week Carl said, yeah, this really happened, that this was actually created from STS-107. You'd think somebody would say, the astronauts didn't die in vain. Look, we have a hepatitis C vaccine. There's this complete disconnect, I believe, between the industry and the potential of space, because they still see it as a very difficult environment and not their regular lab where they can get work done. You know, it is happening. It's going to happen, and I think what's going to make the change in the future is going to be when they start to see regular access, that you don't have to wait for years and keep a standing army in place to get on a space shuttle. When you can get your experiment up every 3 weeks or so, and you can get it down once every couple of months, that's a huge change in the way that you can do R&D. And I think that's what's going to make the difference, is the actual logistics of transportation and access to the platform.
So in response to the Fast Track that the FDA has, they do. This year they actually came out with, or this year they've actually tried to be more helpful to biotech companies. You can actually set up meetings before your pre-IND meetings with them. They'll provide guidance. You can actually call into them. They'll do a telecon with you. They're really trying to move in the direction of helping these small companies, but the initial application is still $1.8 million for FDA approval. And the Fast Track, you know, I want to say is about $200,000. So when you're looking at a small biotech company who's saying, well, you know, I have X number of dollars, we have this much research to do, we have a skeleton crew of people, and we're trying to fund our research, chances are you're probably not going to be able to spend the $200K to get it on the Fast Track unless you have an investor sitting in your back pocket that's going, hey, we're willing to help you. In terms of getting, you know, FDA approval or getting to that endpoint, you're always going to, or I think a small biotech company has to partner with big pharma, because there's no way that the bulk of your cost is going to be in your phase 3 clinical trials. Not phase 1, not phase 2, not your preclinical. It's going to be in your phase 3 clinical trials. And that's where most of the biotech companies actually can probably, or will probably partner with the big pharma companies, because the cost is enormous in that phase 3.
So I'm going to sort of direct this question to Jacque. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, when you're looking at a landscape like this, and you're looking at the whole ecology with a tremendous risk profile, what are things that what is the tipping point for you? When you look at this, what do you think needs to happen in order to have a thriving ecosystem where we can actually develop commercial pipelines of biomedical research?
I believe that most investors would say, would take a line from, you know, the big pharma that we talked about before, saying, call us when you have a lab in space where we can send our technicians and not rely on astronauts. And that's, you know, there are, as you know, a number of people who are working on building those labs that would be, you know, sort of based on the technology of the ISS, but would be more specialized, would be bigger, and would have the, you know, the right environment to function this way, which means you need to actually cater to multiple clients and be able to get them there, get them back with their packages, and provide the security and everything else, and the privacy. I think there are some venture capitalists who are a little bit different. You know, people like us and others who like the challenge of the very early stage of the seed seed stage, which is, of course, the most dangerous, but also the most interesting. And there, the problem is not so much the money, it's to find teams that can bridge the two cultures. Because the venture capital culture today in this valley, is oriented to semiconductors and apps for the iPhone and optics and a lot of things. They typically have not had a lot of experience dealing with the space culture, which has been driven by government, with financially and technically is not in our world. I mean, we just don't work with those kinds of budgets, and especially those kinds of overheads. So there is a you need teams, which was I think the genius of NASA in trying to set up a special venture fund that would have credibility with venture investors, but would also understand what happens when you're in space.
So I'm actually going to redirect this down to Mark and Erika. As you think about what he just said, how does that direct, I mean, you're both sort of hardware people, you're on the hardware side, and I guess my initial thought is that we don't need Pfizer research scientists up on the space station, we need automation. So as you think about building in hardware and what is essentially infrastructure for discovery, how does that sort of inform your strategic direction of your own individual companies?
So we are a human spaceflight company. We have autonomous capability for carrying up experiments on their own. But I think that there are places where putting humans in the loop not only enables, but actually reduces the cost of doing the science. That we can do things much more like in our own lab rather than trying to force automation. But for me, we've talked about speeding up the pipeline. We've talked about getting hands-on with the experiments. I think the third piece of that is actually the middleware. It's the turnkey solutions for companies that don't want to reinvent the wheel of how to do research from their lab to the suborbital or orbital lab. And I think that that's a real ecosystem there. And when I think about, we're moving from a time where right now we're getting on the order of 100 orbital launches a year. The suborbital market studies that the Tori group did suggest that we're moving to, say, 100-ish suborbital launches a year. And that's a doubling in launch rates, not in profit. And the margins on orbital and suborbital are really different. But the ecosystems are going to be hugely profitable for somebody. Right? We are going to have twice as many needs for payload integration services. We are going to have twice as many needs for ground support services, for people who understand how to bring together middleware and customers, for site managers, for everybody that is supporting the research ecosystem. And I think that doubling is something that is being underutilized right now in the investment community. I think there's real profit to be made.
Well, from TechShot's perspective, we began developing hardware for the space station in the mid-90s. This was well before ISS was even fully conceived. It was Space Station Freedom, I think, at the time. But I think the reality, we thought in terms of modularity from day one, because we thought always in terms, even when we were flying shuttle experiments, it was a matter of proving some of those concepts where you would leave the unit that was going to perform a specific function resident on the space station, and you would just ferry samples back and forth from it. An added feature of that, and a part of the automation, was to be able to send data down by telemetry and signals by telemetry. So again, that was always an important part of what we've been doing. So most of the equipment that we've developed has that capability to allow it to either be operated from the ground or autonomously. And we continue to work in that direction, even though right now we're building the bone densitometer, which will be the X-ray machine that will be used to scan the bones of rats and mice that are on the space station. So that will require some crew time, but obviously from Kara's perspective, she's going to be very interested in being able to analyze those results in orbit as well as back on the ground. Yeah, I think there are a lot of things that we've got to do to make sure that investors are comfortable with this. And I talked earlier about how important it was to be able to test these in a laboratory on the ground before you ever get them to space. But the whole premise behind the ISS was to be able to do operations in a very analogous way to the way you do it in a ground-based laboratory. It was to be able to repeat experiments. That's really the only way that you can prove that you're seeing something different in space than what you're seeing on the ground.
Something I wanted to ask you about on that is a lot of times people in the R&D industry were saying that all the equipment on ISS was obsolete. And then people like you would come along and say, look, we've got this great new idea. And NASA would say, well, it'll take us 3 or 4 years to approve that. You know, and it's like, do you see that culture changing now?
Well, we definitely do, Richard. I think it seems some of it may have been prompted by the space station becoming a national laboratory, and if you're going to do world-class science, you've got to have world-class equipment. And I think a lot of the equipment that we've developed and have been developing on the ground is just waiting to be integrated into the system with the flight safety and that sort of thing. So I think we do sense that there is a change. There's an urgency because we don't know how much longer the space station is going to be able to be in use. So I think that's prompted a lot of that urgency.
So let me just add something, because currently we were designing an experiment to go in space and on ground, and what I noticed is a lot of the hardware providers didn't exactly have the hardware capable for us to run the experiments that's currently built. Amazing. We thought, well, you know, we would love to actually fly mice to space and run experiments because it would actually more closely simulate what happens to our peptide through the human body as it's interacting, right? And we were told maybe in a year they'll have a mice habitat that they'll be able to actually fly. And so as a hardware provider, or as a small biotech company that's looking to do experiments, we're having to modify basically our experiment to meet basically, or to run the experiments with what we have, basically what equipment's actually out there, because most of the companies are giving us, well, maybe a year we'll have that, and you know, you don't really want to wait a year to run the experiment. So for us, that's been that's been an obstacle that we're having to overcome, and I'm sure that we're not the only company that's faced with that.
So I want to get through. So we're running a little short to the end here, so I want to get through 2 quick questions. I'm going to combine 2 questions that were posed to me today by Jeff Faust and Dan Raskin. I'm going to try and lump them together into one, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. So the question is basically, with station only guaranteed through 2020, many of you are interested in biomedical experiments that have a really long run time. Is that something that's concerning to you? And then within that context, what do you see as the role of NASA in your, what is an ideal role for NASA with respect to your company and your technology? Is it to you that their biggest contribution to stabilize space station for you, or is it something else? Maybe you could just talk about what you see as the role of NASA in the context of your business. What should they be doing, and should that change? Should that be something different in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years?
All right, well, I will take a crack at that one, Todd. At the risk of alienating our #1 customer, I think NASA is headed in the right direction with what they're doing with trying to promote the commercial industry. I think there's still a long way to go, and I think we've got to continue to see NASA headed in the direction that they are headed in. I like the direction that they're going with cases. I think there are some value in what they are able to achieve, maybe more from the standpoint of what they're able to do from a marketing standpoint and a branding standpoint. That's actually given probably a renewed emphasis with some of these commercial entities to be able to have a little bit of that branding as part of what they're doing with their products that they are developing. So I guess from my perspective, I see things headed in the right direction. Not that we're there yet, not that NASA's there yet, but I think it's definitely headed in the right direction.
So I may be at the wrong hotel here because I thought this was a conference on NewSpace, not on what NASA may or may not do. And I think NewSpace has a big opportunity here. I think that forget venture capital, but the people who are building the new generation of spacecraft and stations in space, habitats in space, are looking at this are looking at big pharma as a client, and are looking at all these new companies with innovative ideas as a tool to get there. And I think the numbers are compelling. If you take a 10, 15, 20-year range, venture capital, of course, is more like a 7 to 10-year range. But even there, as we've said before, people can play, and those companies can develop. Look at the history of biotech, where the biotech companies that were funded by venture capital were really, marginal in terms of the value of their drugs. But in the process, they had developed methodology that big pharma didn't have, and that they had to buy. And that's where the combination really accelerated a new industry, which is enormous now. I think we can see the same model, and when I speak to the people in the NewSpace environment, they do see that. Most of them do see that. So NASA can make a huge contribution to that by helping the change in culture. And we at Red Planet Capital, we had the briefings from NASA, from the doctors at NASA, the people who had studied the astronauts. We've talked to some of the Russian, with their data about cosmonauts, which is actually more extensive than the American experience. There is a lot of stuff that, yes, it has been published, it's not secret, but it has been swept under the rug about what really happens to you when you're in space for a long time. And, and everybody knows about bone and muscle. People are, know a little bit about cardiac, impact. Not much is known about central nervous system impact and proteinomics and everything else. And not to mention the psychiatric aspects of it. All of those things should be surfaced, should be better documented, and really passed on to the people in the new generation who are planning experiments. And I think that's something that NASA could do. NASA has an enormous reserve of talent and knowledge on those topics that is really not exploited very much, because we're still putting the emphasis on the engineering, which is certainly important, but we haven't put the emphasis enough on the biology. That's just my own observation from the outside.
I think Jacque hits the nail on the head right there. And we've accepted some limited co-investment from NASA. But in our minds, for NewSpace to be successful, we have to grow this pie. And we can't keep going back and expecting NASA's budget to grow and more of it to trickle down to us. That's not the way that DC is working these days. So we have to find ways to tap into the corporate research interests and the educational interests and the tourist interests, and figure out how does the whole pie get larger so that we can all profit from that.
I mean, if I was a betting man, which I'm not, I would guess that station will be extended to 2028. It's just the kind of winks and the nods that I've received when I ask about that. But I do think that NASA needs to make a decision on that as soon as possible. I mean, that would really help and assist us if they could make that decision within the Congress in the next couple of years. In the interim, I also believe that the Bigelows, the SpaceX's, the Sierra Nevadas, I think it behooves us all to encourage as much as possible, whatever it takes, that we have to have those, we have to have the Bigelow modules, and eventually, hopefully, its own standalone. I really do believe in Dragon Lab. I think Dragon Lab is just waiting to happen, and beyond with the new crewed vehicles, whether with the Sierra Nevada coming online and others possibly. I think those make our business model much more logical and capable, because once we have the extended different platforms that we can choose from.
So we've got time for just one quick last one. First off, I'll just go ahead and say thank you to everyone for participating. Great discussion. I tend to want to agree with Jacque, because if you think about a primary revenue driver for this new space industry, and I try to think of markets that could handle the capital hurdle, what I come back to is healthcare and biotechnology is the only market on the planet that is a 100% market. Everyone needs healthcare. Everyone needs biotechnology. There is no market segmentation. It is a 100% market. So when you get into a pharmaceutical pipeline where you say, I am okay with spending $326 million in early stage R&D, now you have someone who can afford a spaceflight experiment. So I really tend to agree that that is going to be the primary revenue driver for this ecosystem. And so I guess my last question with the last 4 minutes, is it quick? Yeah, do it.
Yeah, you guys have been talking among yourselves for 15 minutes, and there is an audience out here.
I'm sorry, do you have a question?
Yeah. I wanted to know how much cropland would this thing take that produces jet fuel, and is there a risk of farmers switching from, say, crops that feed people to this crop that produces jet fuel?
If I put it in my backyard in Illinois, yes, absolutely. I'd be competing with corn. If I put it in the West Texas oil fields, I'm competing with prickly cactus pear. So,
okay.
No problem.
All right, thank you.
Is there another one back there? Okay, so I guess my last question for you all really quickly is, why space? Obviously, it would be easier if we all made Facebook apps. So why space?
I was a space cadet from first watching Fireball XL5 in 1960, and it's always been something that it's always been my passion. Space is my passion, but I'm a skeptic. I'm not a cynic. I'm a skeptic, and I like to believe that we really can have an off-world species. That we might be the galactic elders, and it's our job to seed the galaxy. And that sounds crazy, I know, but if you want to do it, you've got to do it in a sustainable and profitable way, because profits, companies, corporations, much as you might love to hate them, is the only real way of developing and delivering a sustainable environment anywhere on the planet or off it. And so when I see an opportunity that got so much upside potential that utilizes space. I mean, I'm not a space company. I'm a biotech company that uses space as a platform. But the end result might be that I'll industrialize low Earth orbit. Is that a good thing for me? Yes, it's not my primary goal, but oh man, am I going to be pleased when I can do that? Yeah, absolutely.
Well, in venture capital, the only way you can make money is by looking at disruptive environments where you can leverage something that you know from your background before anybody else can do it. I mean, if it's not disruptive, then IBM, General Electric, Boeing, and so on, they know how to do it, and they have hundreds of people, a lot smarter than we are, who know how to implement it. Space is disruptive. It poses a number of problems that are beyond business as usual for the big companies. There may not be that much of an incentive for a big company in terms of profits for going into space, except working for the government and essentially for military applications and strategic applications, which is what has happened so far. And then television, as we saw from the previous panels, came in as a killer app for a lot of the satellite applications. What comes after that is really biotech, medicine, genomics, and biology. That's a completely open area, and it's something that can be more important than everything we've done before in space, and where we can make money, and I'm convinced of that.
So you can't work in this industry for the last 8 years and not have drank the Kool-Aid. I mean, I'm just saying. So for me, I probably drank the Kool-Aid, but I also believe that that this is the future for civilization down the road. And for us, you know, again, I know that we're already developing something here on Earth that would work. And if it has the potential to work in space, I know that that's one of the obstacles that have to be overcome. So.
And certainly from TechShot's perspective, space has always been our passion. We believe that there are opportunities to conduct unique research in space, and we're eager to be an enabling entity as a part of that infrastructure.
And I guess I'll close with a quote from Jeff Bezos that's heard pretty often around our office, which is that you don't choose your passions choose you. And if you happen to be passionate about space and interested in living in Seattle or West Texas, let me know because we are hiring.